Amanda Palmer, who's also here, is our grad assistant in the College of Graduate Studies. She's a education PhD student. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can, with such a small group, feel free to just kind of break in. But I probably won't be looking at the chat. Amanda will keep an eye on that. Just going to share my screen. And again, if you have questions throughout or clarifications, like if you weren't at Grad 101 and something doesn't make sense, just let me know. So this is going to be a little bit of a deeper look than we're able to do in Grad 101 at funding your graduate education. So I think we kind of want to just start with thinking about the process and the options, because it can be a little confusing. I think I've noticed a lot of students will come into it with some specific, something they heard or something someone told them. And sometimes there are some misconceptions there, and they're like, oh shoot, like that's how I thought it all worked. But the general point of this and grad 101 is kind of to like really just make it clear how the process works. And for some reason, grad school is like, can be this mystifying or mysterious process, and it shouldn't be that way. So hopefully this helps. So I think it's important to think about it from this framework, and if it turns out that it's a little bit easier, then that's great. But instead of going into it thinking like someone's just going to pay me to go to grad school, like I'll get in and they'll give me all the money. I think it's helpful to look at it like, okay, this is part of the process that's also going to take work from me, not just the application. So kind of going into it thinking like, okay, this is going to require some effort that I want to set aside some time for can be really helpful. So yeah, I think I may have said this last week, but you know, if you're setting aside time to look at programs, you also might want to set aside some time to look at funding opportunities and to do some of that research. So, you know, if you're like, okay, on Tuesday night, I'm going to do this for 2 hours, like make some of that time that you're looking into funding. And it can obviously overlap with your grad school search, but I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're starting to look. Ask for help. So even coming to this is sort of asking for help, right? Like you're getting more information. How does this work? Remembering, I think I said this last week, you have a big network, even if you don't feel like it. You have your faculty, you have anyone you've taken a class with, you have career services and the Writing Center. You may be part of professional organizations. You may have done an internship or a job in the field that you're going into. So if you're confused or just need support or need help with putting together an application for funding, just remember that people are here to help you. You know, and I think I always say in grad studies, if someone has a question, like reach out to me. I may not be the person that can give you the answer, but I can find the person who can. So just reach out to someone and start that process if you need it. And as with most things in life, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So you really do need to be a self-advocate. You know, I think occasionally with like the most star students in the right scenario, people are knocking down your door to fund you. But for the most part, they don't know about you. So like when you show up and they see how awesome you are and you're like, hey, look at me, I'm awesome, then that might be an option. But I think that especially when it comes to funding, even more than like admissions, we get nervous because it's about money and we feel like it's awkward to talk about money and ask for money. That's sort of a cultural thing, right? So just remembering that you've got to ask, you've got to put the feelers out there. I kind of added this year as well. So be a self-advocate, but understand where the money sits. So one thing that happens in my role in grad studies is people reach out a lot to say like, hey, I didn't get funded, or how do I get funded, or all those types of things. But sometimes I'll have folks who just repeatedly come back to me, even when I've explained the resources or let them know that in this case, the assistantship that they're looking for is a decision made by their department, and keep knocking down the door. Like persistence is the only thing that they need to have. And I think that's a little tricky because persistence can be important, but also understanding where the money sits. So like, I don't have a bottom desk drawer full of assistantships that I can give out. The way those work is that at U of I is that they come from the individual programs. So continuing to come back to me that way really does nothing. Like I can't reach out to the program and say, hey, this person's really annoying. Can you give them some money? That's really just not, they're barking up the wrong tree in that case. And I try to tell them that like, hey, if I had money to give out, I would explain that process, but I just don't. So just kind of doing that research. And if you approach someone, you feel like you get a clear answer, figuring out where the money actually is, because that's not a good use of their time either. So we talked a little bit about this in Grad 101 as well, but Institutional funding, or internal funding as it's often called, comes in the form of assistantships. So a graduate assistantship serves two purposes. The first one is it provides you with a part-time paid work experience in your field, and allows you to expand and apply your disciplinary knowledge under supervision. So it's not just a paycheck for you, but it's also often like if you want to become a faculty member, in many instances, it is also work experience in your field. So that can be a plus for you going forward on your CV or resume. It also provides faculty or university staff assistance in carrying out projects and other assignments that they need someone trained at the level that you're at that point in the field to perform. So it's kind of a reciprocal agreement there. So for the most part, you're going to be in your own program. So let's say you're in mechanical engineering, you're going to have a teaching assistantship in that area. But some departments and universities will hire cross disciplines if they need more folks. And some non-academic units may have positions as well. So like COGS is not a non-academic unit, but Amanda's teaching, or rather grad assistantship, is in COGS, and she does academic related things, but they're not specific to her education degree necessarily, although she applies skills that she has because of that. But for example, like campus rec will sometimes have someone, help. Vandal Wellness has a GA. So sometimes there might be, some specialized areas they'd like you to be in a certain field versus another, but sometimes it can just be totally open. Like if you love outdoor stuff and leading backpacking trips, maybe there's an outdoor program at some school that has a GA position. So just keeping that in mind. If you know the ones in your program are limited or you don't get one, kind of poking around and seeing what else is out there. So what's it like to have one? We've talked about the TA is teaching. The research is you're more likely to be in a lab or with a lab group, and the teaching you might be grading papers, or sometimes you are the instructor of record in a class. And the GA is just at U of I, we call it that when it's not specific to a TARA. So like Amanda's a GA. It's about 20 hours a week of work for you, which I wouldn't underestimate. I know a lot of undergrads who work a lot more than 20 hours a week, but once you start grad coursework and you pile 20 hours on top of that, maybe you have other responsibilities as well. I always caution students they're like, oh, 20 hours, I'll get another part-time job that's also 20 hours. That will be a lot. I would not recommend that right away. And some programs actually don't allow you to do that, or at least they don't allow you to work at the university in addition to the assistantship, because they want you to focus on that as well as your coursework. Typically, it's for the academic year only, which is important to keep in mind for budgeting and just for your time. So in one sense, it's nice, right? You're getting whatever the stipend is only for, say, those 9 months, and you have the opportunity to earn more money in the summer, but it doesn't carry you through the summer. So you may need to find other funding, or you may just work a normal outside of the university job. This one is just like a little bit of extra advice, I would say. Establishing a schedule, expectations, and boundaries is in your best interest. And I think, it's unfortunate, but just the way it is, where different advisors or different folks that would have you as a TA, RA, PIs have different expectations, have different working styles. I'm sure you take class with faculty who are different. And it can be easy to, I think, as a faculty member, to sometimes overwork our graduate assistants and not really adhere to the 20 hours a week thing. And I think it's really hard when you're a new graduate student and you want to prove that you can do a good job and that you deserve this funding, to kind of do whatever it takes or do whatever you're asked to do. But I would be careful of that. I've talked to graduate students that have gotten in those positions where they're like, oh my gosh, like my advisor called me at midnight to ask me to go check on these mice in the lab. And that just was like too much. But I felt like I should go or they would take away my funding. And obviously that's just not a place anyone wants to be, because then you're sort of dealing with having to discipline the advisor and then the student feels awkward. But I think just being clear in the beginning, like if someone's asking you to do something way outside, just be like, hey, I have personal commitments at that time, and being confident with that. And you can always approach whatever school you're at. If you're having issues like that, I would approach the grad college if you are, because I think you're going to set yourself up. As I'm saying that, I'm thinking like Amanda and I don't always have like the most definite schedule, but hopefully she can vouch for the fact that I'm not regularly making her work like 60 hours a week, hopefully. Sometimes she likes spending extra time on things, so that's on her. She can tell you how it really is after I get off the call. So how do I get one? So this is like a very murky area, I think, where it can be difficult for students, and I wish there was a system that was the same at every institution, or even the same at U of I. So in some programs, and I would say often particularly in STEM research-based programs, it's common to connect with faculty members in advance to secure them as your advisor and discuss funding, sometimes even before you apply to the program. It's like you kind of get to that agreement and then they're like, okay, you're going to apply. They know, they've seen your info and your transcript, your resume. They're like, you're going to apply, you're going to get in, you're going to get this money. And sometimes that catches people off guard who didn't know about that. And they're like, oh, I just applied and like I figured I would be eligible. So I think just figuring that out as you're looking at programs, like, is that what these programs that I'm looking at require? And you can ask, when you contact them, like, what is the typical process if you can't find that online? You can ask faculty or you can ask an admin in the program, how does this work? Let's see here. And I think starting early too is important for that. Especially if it's an RA, which is typically a grant funded position. Once that money is gone, it's gone, there's nothing else. And that's the timeline of that can be difficult because grants come and go at different times. So just kind of staying in touch, like if you're not planning to go like right away, or you're not a senior looking to try to go next fall, like staying in touch with people over a couple of years sometimes helps. They may say, I just filled my last position, but I just got this new grant and I'm about to get this new grant. Hopefully I'll get this new grant and I may have some more funding. So I'll let you know. I understand the feeling because this would bother me too, of like, not of the uncertainty, right? Like you just want to know, do I have funding or not? And it's super stressful, but sometimes that's just the way that grants work. So other programs will have a certain number of assistantships available to award. And that's the way our TA positions work. And I can only speak to U of I in terms of the way we do it. Other schools do it differently. But our TAs are centrally funded through the College of Graduate Studies, and they are doled out to programs. And then the deans and the programs, or the deans dole them out to the programs, and then the programs decide how they want to award them. And so those are just kind of sitting there, and the program can decide in terms of who applies or who's currently in the program, who they want to fund. And these could be fully funded. Typically, the language when someone says like, oh, that program is a fully funded program, and we have a few at U of I, that means everybody they accept is guaranteed funding. So like if you get in, you have a TA-ship. And they typically will advertise that pretty well because it's a nice thing. So keeping an eye out for that. So the other option are that they may select some applicants to receive funding based on their application for admission. So they may say, these were our top, as they're selecting, these were our top 3 out of 5 that we're admitting. So we're going to give TAs to those because they don't have enough for everyone. I think that's a really difficult situation. I had a personal experience with that with a program that I had advertised themselves as fully funded, and then they lost some funding, which can happen in between the time I applied. And it was a selective program, and they were admitting 3 people. And I was admitted, and they had been fully funded, but then they were like, we only have funding for 1. And we funded our top admit, and but like for next year, you'll basically be competing, the 3 of you. So maybe if you're super good, you could get the funding next year. And that sounded terrible to me. That sounded like I'm going to come into this program with 2 other people and be in this small cohort, and then we're going to be fighting for money. And that was really hard because like that was a really good program, and I really liked it, and I really liked the faculty. But I just kept thinking about that scenario and was like, this is going to be stressful enough to do this grad work. And if I can't even like, how will I have a relationship with the people in my program if we're fighting for 1 TA-ship? So just something to consider when that's part of it. The other thing, and this is one that sometimes is an unfortunate, happens to people, and I think this is not often the case at UOI, but sometimes there's like a separate application if you want a TA-ship. So like I've known people in different programs where they apply and they're all excited and then they're like, oh, did I get a TA? And they're like, oh, well, you didn't apply for the TA. They didn't even know there was a separate application. So that's a good question to ask. Is there an additional application for funding or for an assistantship? So you're getting the theme, like do your research, ask the questions. It's going to be different by institution, which can be frustrating, but that's just the way it is. And then that last one is just, does the university offer anything? You guys are all like blocking my pictures here. Anything outside your department? It's good to ask that question. So this is kind of a continuation of how you're going to get that funding. And if you are in an area where you determine that like people are expected to reach out and make contact with an advisor prior, this is an example of what you might want to do. So this is just sort of a funny letter to a faculty member from an undergraduate student looking to connect to potentially find an advisor. So some things you want to remember when you're reaching out, and this could be an email, should be an email. Be professional and accurate. So you don't want to just say, hey, Rosalind, right? You want to address them by their full name. You could say, Dr. Darwin, I didn't write this. I think one thing, especially with women faculty members, it's much more common for them not to have the doctor on their name or to be called Miss or something like that. But if this person has a PhD, you want to indicate that when you're addressing them. So do your homework and connect your interests. So most of the time you can find, like on our U of I pages, you go to a program and you see the faculty in that program and you can look at their bios, what kind of research have they done, publications, awards. So you find Dr. Darwin and she has all this cool research that intersects with your interests or maybe some research you've done. So making sure as you write this, you're connecting those interests. So this student is saying that they read her paper on snails. They're very interested in this work. They're mentioning who they are and what the work that they're doing and how Dr. Darwin's work might connect with their work. So you want to kind of like let them know you did some research on them and then tell them about yourself and then let them know how you might match up. You don't want to sort of like leave it to them to research you. I think it's also helpful if you look at the last line here, sort of to let people know what your long-term goals are. And at this link, and Amanda can send these out to you, it talks to you a little bit about how to connect the dots in the letter. I would say, avoiding marketing industry language. This doesn't need to be flashy. It just needs to do the job. And show, don't tell. So talk about the research you've actually done. I think we want to be careful of words like, I'm really diligent and organized and a hard worker, like that's great, but there's no way for them to know if that's true. So just talking about the things that you've actually done. And then attach your resume or CV. So that can help them. Maybe you've done some undergraduate research or had an internship, but that's definitely a professional way to do it. I would say too here, this comes up a lot. You put this together, you're super excited but nervous because you really want to work with Dr. Darwin and you hope she has funding, and then you hear nothing. A week, 2 weeks tick by and you're like, oh my gosh, she must think I'm terrible and stupid and not good enough to work with her. I would say she doesn't think you're terrible or stupid. Sometimes that may be the case, that you're not, she's not going to select you to work with her or get funding. More often than not, it's that she doesn't check email that often, or she's in the field, or she's just a super busy faculty member. So I wouldn't lose hope and just think, be super down on yourself. I'm sure you're experienced with people not responding to your emails on the first try. So I think it's fair after a couple of weeks to send another one. And then another thing you could do is to reach out to the program. So maybe call an administrative coordinator and say, hey, I reached out to Dr. Darwin. I didn't hear anything by email. Is there a better way to contact her? Sometimes they'll say, oh, I'll let her know that. They might say like, send another email. I sometimes say this, send them another email and I'll follow up with them to let them know. So just making a connection, not losing hope or getting down on yourself is important. So networking as well. So I've heard a lot of good stories about students getting assistantships in grad programs outside of U of I because their faculty, their undergraduate advisor has connections in that field all over, right? So your advisor went to grad school. They went to undergrad and they went to at least one grad school, probably, if not multiple. And so they know a lot of people working in the field all over the country because then those people went and worked other places. So I think, chatting with them, letting them know what you're interested in. Hey, do you know anyone, in other programs? Or maybe, hey, do you know anyone in this specific program? I think in general, just letting your undergraduate advisor or another faculty member you may be closer to that you're looking at grad schools and looking for funding is because then it's just on their radar, right? Like maybe they see someone at a conference and they're like, oh my gosh, my student Miranda is looking at a program like that, and then they might just chat with them. That happens more often than you would think. You also might be at conferences or might have professional associations, but just jumping even this year on virtual conferences, you see someone present from, the University of Texas, and you're like, oh, that's the department of the program that I'm interested in. Reach out to them afterwards, make those connections. Just kind of what we mentioned, like just thinking about all the places that you're connected and not hesitating. I think I've always felt a little nervous to do this if I've been looking for a job or something, but it's amazing when you reach out to someone you haven't even like as you get older who you haven't talked to in a long time, and they're like, oh my gosh, how are you doing? I'd love to connect you. I think if you've had a good relationship, working relationship or peer colleague with someone, I mean, I try to think about it yourself, right? Like it's someone that you liked and worked well with, reach back out to you 5 years later, you'd probably say, oh yeah, hey, I'd be happy to help you out. So they're likely to do the same. So you get to the place where you've made these connections, you've gotten a TA or an RA or GA through one of these methods. So the question is now what do you do? It's very tempting to just be like, all my money problems are solved. It's going to be great. And you're allowed to have a little celebration for sure, because that's great to get funded. But read through the offer letter thoroughly. Make sure you have an official letter on university letterhead that is signed with the details of your offer. If you get an email, that's great, but you want to have something formal. So don't hesitate to ask for that. It's like the thing that's going to pay your bills for the next however long. So some things you want to make sure you're clear on. What percentage of tuition is covered? In-state, out-of-state, both, half, full. That's critical info. What is the stipend? So how much are you going to be paid? And I didn't mention this, and this is just dependent on the university's payroll, but like how often do you get paid, right? Like just figuring out I need to pay rent, I need to do this. For the most part, like at U of I, it's the same as it's like a biweekly. That's when everybody gets paid. Does this include student fees? More often than not, it doesn't. And those can be sizable, especially if you're like kind of keeping a tight budget and then you find out you have to pay the fees out of your stipend or whatever kind of personal money you have. And I say this a lot. I said it in Grad 101, but calculate the cost of living if it's somewhere new based on the money that you're getting, because it just really is a game changer, especially if you've been in Moscow for 4 years and maybe you lived off campus, you get used to what the rent is like here and you just sort of are thinking about that. And then you go somewhere that's maybe more expensive because most places are more expensive, possibly a few or less, but just make sure that that's going to work for you. Some other things to remember, again, just asking questions. And then this one too. So if you have a better offer, so if you have more than one offer, which is really nice, don't hesitate, but say, okay, you have two offers and one is your first choice program, but your second choice program or your fifth choice program gave you more money. So it is totally fair to approach that first choice program and say, hey, I'm really interested in this program. It's my number one choice, but this other place gave me like a bunch more money. And, obviously that would be helpful for my living expenses. Do you have any extra? I think if you do that respectfully, again, the worst they can say is, no, I'm sorry, we don't have any extra. Sometimes they will. I've definitely seen situations where programs have matched an offer for a student that they really would like to bring on. So that's definitely fair game. They can also say no. Oftentimes, at U of I, that happens a lot with us. Like there just isn't any more money. Like we've doled it all out. So if they say no, then you at least have your answer and you can make those decisions. And inquiring about funds to visit campus as well. So I would say if you are admitted with a funded offer, in a lot of ways, you're in control of the game. They have said that they want you and they're willing to pay you for it. So you should feel proud of that. And you should be like, hey, they've already told me that like I am one of their top choices. So it's fair game to say, hey, like I'd really love to consider this program. Thank you so much for the admission and the funded offer. I've never been to New Mexico and I'd love to visit to see, make sure it's a good fit for me. Is there any funding for that? And they may or may not have it, but again, they're not going to hold it against you for asking. It's always hard to ask, but it's definitely worth doing. So external funding, grants and fellowships that are not university based is what we're talking about here. So the good news, there's tons of sources of funding out there. The bad news is that there's tons of funding sources. So it's really overwhelming to look through them. I feel overwhelmed all the time when I look at funding in general for all sorts of things. So here's some tips to kind of navigate. Again, setting aside time. I think that's my biggest one. I'm like, oh, I want to look for some funding for this particular effort. Like, let me go do that for 15 minutes. And then you're like down a rabbit hole and suddenly it's an hour and you're like, oh my gosh, this is taking so much time. So setting more time aside in advance. Focus on the larger pots. So depending on how much you think you need, if you're looking to fund your whole graduate education externally, if you're just looking for like an extra $5,000, know what you need. And definitely focus on the larger pot. So, like you don't need a lot of $25 scholarships. That's going to not add up very quickly. But I would say things like $1,000, even 500, depending, like those do add up, especially if you're not trying to fund the whole thing, or maybe you have funding next year, but not this year, something like that, or the summer. Because usually the bigger the pots, the more competitive they are. Sometimes if you read all the details, you'll find like everybody who applies to this gets $1,000. I mean, things like that come up where it's like, oh gosh, like that's an easy $1,000. So definitely worth your time. Being specific, I think this is huge. So it's easy to get excited about the big money. That's just like generally for graduate work. But the more specific you can get, the fewer people are going to be applying for that. So you really narrow down the pool. So money that's awarded in your field or with your personal demographics in mind. So I think we think about our fields a lot, but we don't necessarily think always about demographics. So like things like, are you a first generation college student? And then I always say like silly things, like, are you a juggler, right? Like there's some weird stuff out there. So like there might be some specific things about you or your family that would qualify you for opportunities that quickly cut other people out, right? Like I'm a terrible juggler, so I'm not applying to that. So you don't have to compete against me. So thinking about that kind of stuff can be helpful. Even maybe make a list, like what's all the stuff about me that might apply, or talk to someone else and have them give you some feedback on that. Again, asking for help, talking with your advisor, if you know any current grad students, mentors, professional organizations, faculty and staff. I think advising also, academic coaching. There's a lot of folks out there, especially at the undergrad level at U of I, that are really happy to assist. I think apply as much as you can do well. So you don't want to throw a lot of like half crappy applications out there. Again, these are competitive, and so it's sort of a waste of your time to throw together something like that's wasted time because you're not probably going to get it. Cast a wide net, but make sure, just do as much as you can do well to the best of your ability. The more you apply for, the more likely you are to get some funding. But again, it's like, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. If you don't apply, you won't get anything. And again, it rarely drops from the sky. So you do have to get out there. I was going to say something else about that. I forget. So we do have, depending on what year you are, in the fall, each year we'll do a prestigious fellowship workshop series. So there are some big ones. The National Science Foundation, so it's for STEM fields, has a graduate research fellowship program. That is external fellowship, but we help you apply through U of I. So that is full funding, and you can take it with you anywhere you want to go. There's a couple others, like one through the Department of Defense, the Ford Foundation, which is if you're interested in going into the professoriate. So those are some big ones that give you like over $30,000 of a stipend every year and pay for all your tuition wherever you want to go. And so if those are sort of good fits for you, I always recommend talking with your advisor about those, and especially for the NSF opportunity, those are due in October of your senior year. So you want to start working with, I would mention it to your advisor now if you're looking at any of those, working on it over the summer, and then the Ford and the DOD are a little bit later, but it's good to start thinking about those early. And those are very competitive, but we have folks from U of I get the NSF GRFP every year. So it's a good one to apply for. I just wanted to mention the Distinguished Scholarship Program. If you haven't worked with Dr. Sarath Chandra before, she's a faculty member in sociology, and she and I kind of tag team a little bit on funding and prestigious fellowship and scholarship opportunities. She kind of handles at the undergraduate level, and maybe if she has someone looking at the GRFP, she'll refer them to me. But she's a great contact if you're not a senior probably yet, to chat with her about opportunities, and sometimes those carry over to grad school as well. So we talked about this in Grad 101, but there are also some scholarships that are tied to universities and departments. So those would be sort of institutional, but more in the scholarship form versus the assistantship form. So I think just staying aware of what's happening on your campus and what's going on is important. It seems silly, but like read your emails, like read the daily or the MyUI or whatever those things are. It feels like we get busy and we don't have time for that, but a lot of that stuff is advertised there, and you might miss something if you don't check. And then Pivot is a database that you have access to as a U of I student. U of I subscribes and pays for that, so you can create a profile for free. Those are all going to be external funding opportunities. They're all really vetted. They're current. All the information will be there. It's easy to see deadlines. There's none of that like scary Google searching where you're not sure if what you're looking at is legit or not. And those are kind of going to match what I said, like streamlining it to your demographics and your interests. So I recommend, I have a pivot profile and I get emails every week that suggest funding for things I've put in there. And I don't always like do those things, right? But I like to have it generating and keeping me aware of what's out there. You can just Google like U of I pivot and you'll find it. So some other sources to consider. The GI Bill, some folks still have eligibility and money left there at the grad point. Employer funded, if you're already working full-time, or later on if you're working full-time, sometimes they'll pay for grad school. If you work at U of I, you can take classes for $5 a credit. So a lot of staff members will do grad school that way. It's worth noting some programs have a few professional programs. I think I'm not sure I'm up to date on that, but a few have done away with that because so many people were taking it that way. But oftentimes if you're working in an academic institution, you'll get at least a discount. Obviously, if you have personal or family money or savings and loans, and obviously I don't want you to be saddled with debt, but it's not up to me how you want to manage, and sometimes taking a small loan to make up a gap can make sense if you feel comfortable about paying it back. I think too, sometimes if you're going into a very lucrative field, that can be an okay option because you're more likely to make a good amount of money quickly. So the FAFSA is where you can find out your eligibility for loans. And I hammered this in last week, but I'll say it again. The only thing the FAFSA gets you at the grad level is your loan eligibility. There's no need-based federal aid at the graduate level at all. So if you've gotten a lot as an undergrad or any by you or your family members filling out the FAFSA, that just doesn't exist at the grad level, which can be a shock and is unfortunate, but is the way it is. I would say be careful with private loans. Sometimes if you like fill out the FAFSA or you just are looking, like the algorithms will start sending you emails about private loans. It's just really hard to vet those. And there are definitely some scams out there. So just do your homework. And you can, at studentaid.gov, you can find up-to-date and accurate information that's not scammy about that stuff. So an additional part-time work, I know people do make it work that way. But some assistantships will prohibit additional work or fellowships. So that's something worth asking too. And also just being careful, thinking like, oh, I'm going to have time to do all this work. Again, you're also going to have a rigorous academic schedule and a lot of work. And so especially the first semester, I would always advise not taking on additional if you can help it, to see how it goes and get into the program. And then if you feel like you're managing it, taking that on additionally. So what's next? So 3 or more months away from the app deadline, you want to keep doing your research, you're connecting with faculty at desired programs, you're figuring out how it works. I think that's really critical. And just how does it work at the programs I'm interested in? Trying to get a clear sense of that so you can move forward and sort of figure out what your timeline is. Because the more I think you're expected to connect and get funding through connecting to faculty, the more it's important to have that information early and start doing that. So once you've applied but haven't heard back yet, contacting and asking the programs about funding, especially if you don't feel like you're totally clear. It's also fair game to contact faculty after you've applied. It doesn't always have to happen before. And know what the options are going to be when you hear back. So you're ready, if you get accepted, what kind of decision you need to make, what your options are. And make some time at that time, right? Like you're done with applications. So it's a good time to explore external funding. And if you're still here, and even if you're not, you can, for your lifetime, reconnect with folks at U of I and ask questions then and keep doing research. So C is you're in, but you have no funding, which is disappointing. But don't lose heart. You want to make some time to explore external funding options, meet with faculty, connect with faculty at your desired programs, connect with graduate support programming, like connect with me at your desired program or your desired school. Connect with current students too. I think this one people forget about. You know, if you're at a program, if you're looking at a program where you're accepted and not funded, chances are there's other people in that program who aren't funded. And so how are they doing it? You know, I doubt they're going to say, oh, I found this pot of gold over here, you can have some too. But, you know, they might have some feedback on other types of opportunities they found or work or whatever it might be, because those are real grad students doing it in real time right now. And I think that that's helpful to just see what they're up to. So that is all the presentation. Definitely open for questions. I put Dr. Sarachandra's contact info here too. If you're more of an underclassman and you want to look at opportunities at the undergraduate level that could fund you sort of now, or our prestigious scholarships that may carry over. The other thing I would say, and this is a good thing and a bad thing, is that oftentimes the more you get of these, the more you get. So like if you get a prestigious fellowship of some kind or scholarship at the undergrad level, it will help you in getting future ones. You're sort of vetted. The other thing I would say is that even if you're like an honorable mention or a finalist, or at the graduate level, even if you've done some really rigorous funding apps but haven't gotten them, those look really good on your resume and CV. So like the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, for example, the NSF one I talked about, we had, I think, 2 honorable mentions. We had a bunch of people who got it, but we had 2 honorable mentions at U of I last year. And that's a big deal. They didn't get any money, but going forward on their CV to say that they were an honorable mention for the GRFP says quite a bit to employer, to future grad school. Someone at the National Science Foundation judged them to be basically like almost as awesome as the people who won, you know? So I think sometimes we feel like if we apply for something and don't get it, it's just a total loss. But it's really not with a lot of this prestigious external funding. And you're just going to be more prepared in the future to apply for these opportunities. You're going to have done it. It's not like, oh my God, how do these work? You're going to feel more prepared the next time you apply and more likely to get it. Were there questions in the chat, Amanda? Nope. Okay. Here for any questions. Also, feel free to reach out to me if you think of additional ones. Now I'll leave so Amanda can tell you all about what it's like to be a GA. The second part of this, just kidding. I would never allow that. Well, if no one has questions, thanks for coming. And hopefully this helped you clarify a little bit of how the process works, and good luck with your grad school search. Thanks, everyone.